Well, good morning, class, once again. We want to talk today about the book of James. This is just a very, very short epistle, but it has some great truth in this book. The book of James, just these five little chapters, was written by James, the brother of Christ. It is the most Jewish of the New Testament books. A lot of similarities between the book of James and the Sermon on the Mount. The book of James was one of the first books of the New Testament to be written. Some think it may be the first book of the New Testament written. I've read some that think that the book of Galatians may have been first, and James was written in response to some misunderstandings there. But nevertheless, the book of James is written somewhere around the same time. The key concept of the book of James is that faith without works is dead. In fact, in some translations it says, you see how that by works a man is justified and not by faith alone. So the key concept is you must have works along with your faith. A lot of people have pictured that there's a conflict between the Apostle Paul and this Apostle James, the brother of Christ. Now, that's not really true. They're speaking from a different perspective. James is a church leader. And guess what church leaders always have the privilege of doing? Every time there is a problem, they bring in the church leader to resolve the issue. And so he goes from one problem to the next problem to the next problem. And it is one issue after another. And there's a battle over this and a battle over that. And so James is simply saying, it's time for you people to straighten up your lives and live like you're supposed to. You need to add some good works to go with your faith. The Apostle Paul, his ministry is sharing the gospel to those who have never heard the gospel. He's sharing the gospel to the heathen. And when you're talking to people who do not know Jesus Christ, who believe in some false god, the Apostle Paul says, let me tell you about Jesus Christ and why you need to believe in him. So his emphasis is faith in Jesus. Now, if the Apostle Paul were in an area of church leadership, he might sound a lot like James in his emphasis. In fact, if you look at the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he doesn't really talk about faith much. Instead, he talks about their life, their behavior, and how they need to live right. There's no conflict. You see, if James were on the forefront of evangelizing, James would probably sound like Paul. Because really, it's the type of ministry they're in. We need both sides of it. We must believe, but we must live it. Paul emphasizes the faith side. James emphasizes the works side. The theme of this book is works. The key passage for the book is in chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, which show the necessity of works. He says, what doth it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and hath not works? Can faith save him? And then he says, even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. And he says it again, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered his son Isaac upon the altar? Seest then how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? And he says, for as the body without the spirit is dead, even so faith without works is dead also. If a person genuinely has faith, works will follow. But it is also true that in the process of having genuine faith, we must live right as we present ourselves to God and believe for his salvation. Just like Rahab the harlot did. How did she get faith? By hiding the spies. She cast her lot with the people of Israel. That's how her works brought her to the point where she became part of the people of God. The topics of the book of James Each of these are related to works. In chapter 1, James talks about the issue of temptation. There's two different types of temptation according to James. There is a temptation or a testing where God is not trying to get us to commit sin, but He is trying to test us to build our strength. And, in reality, there's that kind of temptation. God did tempt Abraham, for example, when He told him to offer his son Isaac. It's really God did test Abraham. And God may put you to the test today to see if you really want to serve Him or not. But on the other hand, James makes it very clear that God does not do the other kind of temptation. God does not tempt anybody ever at any time to commit sin. Never. He's not interested in people committing sin. The devil may tempt you to sin. He will never tempt you. James says that we're to count it joy when we fall into testing of God. I'll tell you what, when I go through difficulty, I don't count it joy. Maybe I need more faith. James says, count it all joy. James says, I want to be a better Christian. And if I have to go through difficulty to become a better Christian, let me go through that difficulty. Let me be tested. Let me go through the battle. If the battle will make in me a better person. But the reality is this. When you've gone through the battle, God does help you to become a better person. The steps toward temptation to sin. It says we're drawn away of our own desires. Now let me give an example this way. Every one of us probably would say we could use a little more money. Is that wrong? No. We would like more money. But when money begins to get a foothold down in our life, is that a problem? You see, drawn away of our own desires. Normal, natural, good desires. But get out of place. In reality, God is not going to withhold any good thing from you. But it's in God's time and God's place and God's way. We're drawn away of our own desires. We surrender to that desire. Money, or whatever it is, gets hold of us. And we would rather have that than God. Now, we may not know how bad off we are. We may not know how it's got its tentacles fastened around us. But we surrender to that desire. Every man is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. Now, it comes when opportunity strikes. That's when the sin actually occurs. And then sin will eventually bring eternal spiritual death. Sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. We've got a lot of people walking around our churches. They have something inside of them they've already given up on. They don't know it yet. Satan is just waiting for the right time to strike. And when it happens, they are going to fall. Let me just say this. That's why you need to get sanctified. God knows what's deep down inside of the heart. God knows the issue that you don't want to give up. And if you're not willing to give it up in a revival service at an altar of prayer, you definitely aren't going to give it up in the middle of temptation. If you don't get rid of it, it will get you in the end. James talks a little bit about the mirror here. He said, be doers of the word and not hearers only. He said, we're like a man that beholds his face in a glass and goes his way and promptly forgets what manner of man he was. He talks about works in relationship to the tongue. There was this lady at the altar Uncle Bud Robinson, who was known for his humor at times, was praying with her. And finally he said, "Lady, could you tell me what your problem is?" And she said, well, I can't get my tongue on the altar. He says, "Lady, it's 90 feet long. How long do you need?" And the reality is this. James says the tongue is a little member and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. Even so the tongue is among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. He says the tongue can no man tame, for it is a deadly evil, full of deadly poison. He compares it to a fire. He says the tongue is impossible to tame. He says our speech should be consistent. James talks about judging in relation to works. He says it's not our place to judge others. God's the judge and not us. James talks about the wealthy in the aspect here. He says in chapter 1 that they should rejoice when they lose their wealth. In chapter 2, James says that we should not be partial or prejudiced and treat a wealthy person better than a poor person. He says partiality and prejudice against the poor is a sin. And if you violate the law in one point, you're guilty of all. He says in chapter 4 that the desires for more things will cause conflict in our lives. He says that our sinful desires will hinder our prayer. So again and again, the book of James will talk about this aspect of the rich and the wealthy. If I can find that passage right here, I was going to read it to you. But, well, get one more page turned over right there. You lust and have not. You kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet ye have not because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lusts. He talks about we should be careful about boasting of our plans and leaving the Lord out in the process of getting wealthy. He encourages the poor, giving Job as an example, and says to be patient to the coming of the Lord. And all in relationship to the wealthy. James is not very positive toward the wealthy at all. In relationship to prayer, he says we should anoint the sick and pray for them. And then he says that the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. He said Elijah was a man subject to like passions or subject to like emotions like we have. And he prayed earnestly that it might not rain, and it rained not by the space of 3 years and 6 months. And you know, Elijah was a man that had the emotions we have. He got excited and thrilled as he ran from Mount Carmel to Jezreel, to the city of Jezreel, and outran Ahab's chariot. But the next day he became absolutely depressed and took off running from Jezebel and went down to a cave clear down at Mount Sinai, several hundred miles away, walking the whole way. And then when he got there, he said, "Lord, let me die." Emotions, like us. Sometimes we're feeling great. We can take on the world. And sometimes we're depressed and we think, why are we here? But that was Elijah too. Holiness is found in the book of James in some interesting ways. James will use the term double-minded to talk about holiness. Over in chapter 4, he makes this statement about being double-minded. He said, "Purify your hearts, ye double-minded." Chapter 1, he said, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. You got a mind to serve God, then a mind to serve self, a mind to serve God, a mind to serve self. Sometimes you're this way, sometimes you sway over this direction. Well, you need to settle which way you're going. A double mind is unstable. And he says, purify your hearts, you double-minded. A second way that he talks about holiness is he calls it wisdom from above. If you take a look at chapter 3, it says this: the wisdom that is from above is first pure. That's holiness. Secondly, it's peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And it goes through the characteristics of holiness. And he calls it the wisdom that is from above. In chapter 1, it gives this statement. It says, if any of you lack wisdom, what is he talking about? If any of you lacks this wisdom from above, this experience that will make you pure, peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, without partiality, without hypocrisy. If that's what you're lacking, you need wisdom from above. If any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. If you need sanctified, go to God and say, Lord, I want that wisdom. The promise is this: if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Well, that's the book of James. Have a wonderful day.